Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping before we get started. So the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the ISAC website. And also we're asking if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature and all questions will be answered at the end. So I will now hand it over to Russell. Thank you.
I see on the participants that there are a lot of people popping in. And so knowing Courtney said there were over 200 people, I am going to give it, if we can, just a little bit of time to let people pop on before I get going. I'm smiling because the number went up and then it went back down. So apparently people got bored and they're not saying anything. I'm bored. Seems that the people joining us slowed down quite a bit. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Russell Wood, and I am the CEO for Central Iowa Community Services. I work as a Franklin County employee, and we are going to give an update today on the mental health or behavioral health legislation that was passed by the governor, or excuse me, by the legislature and signed by the governor a week ago Wednesday. And I have with me May Hinchin, who I will let introduce herself.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm May Hinchin. I'm the CEO for the Mental Health and Disability Services of the East Central Region.
We did have a couple of other people that we had talked to about joining us as well to give different perspectives on what they are seeing as things to be aware of, but unfortunately they were unable to join us. Just to give you a little bit of an overview on what we're planning on doing today, I'm going to go over the bill, but not point by point, but more in general terms of what is it doing and how does that affect county government. And I am going to, as much as possible, try to avoid speculation, which is going to be difficult because we're still not sure what the entire scope of work is. The timelines are a little ambiguous or murky or gray, whatever term you want to use. And we're also going to try to not have an approach where we just look at everything that's going to be wrong under this, but actually look at what are some potential benefits from this and how can we capitalize on those benefits for our constituents, which are the people that live in Iowa. So in a nutshell, just to kind of start it off, the legislation that was passed and signed by the governor seeks to establish a system, a behavioral health system. What we have right now, we have a number of IPN, which is Integrated Provider Network providers. Those are individuals who actually get a block grant from the state to provide certain substance use disorder services. And then we have, at this point, 13 mental health and disability services regions. What the bill does is it combines all of those, and I think there's a total of 31 between the groups, into 7 behavioral health districts. There's a lot of conversation that has been had about, is it 7? Is it something different? Is it a different number? I do know that in the governor's comments on Wednesday, a week before last, 2 weeks ago, I guess today is Wednesday, that she did say 7 districts, and there was a draft map that was put out that does establish those 7 districts. The department has identified, and I want to be very clear on this because a lot of people are looking at where does that put me in the map. The department has identified and continues to meet with lots of different people that this map is not a final map. It is a draft map, and we'll come back to timelines and talk about timelines in a little bit and about what that map looks like. But I want to kind of give a general overview of what the legislation does specifically through the verbiage and what the legislation does just because the legislation is actually there, and how that is going to affect the work that counties are currently doing and may be doing in the future. First, it does establish behavioral health. Right now, with MHDS regions, that stands for Mental Health and Disability Services, substance use disorder services are not covered under the umbrella of what MHDS regions do. If an individual has a multi-occurring issue, which is substance use disorder, and a mental health or developmental or intellectual disability, then regions may pay for services for those folks. But if it's straight substance use disorder, regions do not coordinate and fund those services. We have not had that as part of the funding that has been made available to us as regions. Historically, counties have funded some of those services and programs, and they still have the option, depending on what they're doing, whether they're continuing to fund some programs. That is a county by county decision on what they're doing there. It then takes, not only does it put substance use disorder services in the behavioral health, it takes the disability services out. And what it's doing is it's moving disability services, which in CICS, Central Iowa Community Services, that includes intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, brain injuries. Those services are being moved to aging and disability resource centers. They're also looking at long-term services and supports for folks that have brain health or mental health issues, also going over to the aging and disability resource centers. In the state Department of Health and Human Services, they have two divisions that will cover this. One is aging and disability services. The other is behavioral health. And behavioral health then would be where the behavioral health region administrative service organization, where their contracts would be. The state is also going to be developing administrative service organizations for the aging and disability resource centers to manage the disabilities part of the system, and that will come under the Aging and Disability Services division within the department at this point in time. The bill, after combining those groups, sets up administrative service organizations. At this point in time, mental health and disability services regions do operate similar to what the vision of an administrative service organization is. The money that the state currently has in the system will come to the administrative service organization to utilize to meet the outcomes of the contract that will be identified in the scope of work, that will be in a request for proposals. The administrative service organization could be the same entity if they're looking at behavioral health as the person who's looking at aging and disability resource center. It could be different entities. An administrative service organization could be an administrative service organization in multiple districts. But regardless of that, the administrative service organization is the entity that will be responsible for ensuring the development and implementation of a system of care to meet the needs of the individuals in that district. Currently, when you look at behavioral health, we understand that the regions cover the mental health part of that. The substance use disorder portion of that is currently being handled by the IPN, which is Integrated Provider Network providers. And if you look in your regions or in your county areas, you probably know who your IPN provider is. There are also providers that provide substance use services on outpatient. But if you look at IPN providers, those are specialized providers that get block grants to provide certain types of services outside of just providing only the outpatient services. As an example, many mental health centers also provide substance use treatment. That's a little different than IPN. That's where the current substance use disability services, when it comes to intellectual developmental disabilities and brain injuries, has typically and historically fallen under the regions, at least for the past 10 years as well. The aging part of it has fallen under the area agencies on aging, and that will not change. And I think that's important because we've heard from some area agencies on aging that they may be getting messages from counties or regional folk that the Older Americans Act, which is a federal piece of legislation, is going to fall under the regions or the behavioral health districts or the ASOs, and that is not what the department has indicated. Historically, the federal government has set up what they refer to as Aging and Disability Resource Centers with the intent that those entities would be the place where people would go to get supports when looking at issues surrounding aging, like long-term care, caretaker, meals, things like that. But they also were intended to be the place where people go to get assistance with long-term services and supports for their disabilities. That did not build out as much under the area agencies on aging, because historically counties and then regions had been the ones that had led the overview and coordination and development of those programs. As such, currently the ADRCs primarily serve individuals who are 60 years or older. And when it comes to disabilities, it's primarily for folks who are disabled and have met that 60-year-old threshold, and potentially would be not necessarily intellectual or developmental disabilities. There has been a system that has been divided with subject matter experts with aging under the AAAs and disabilities under the mental health and disability services regions. So that is going to bring some different perspective to the table. In the piece of legislation that was passed, it did remove language in Iowa code that stated that the department shall designate area agencies on aging as aging and disability resource centers. And now it currently says that the department shall designate aging and disability resource centers. The reason for that change is that it would still allow for an area agency on aging to be an aging and disability resource center. I know it gets a little complicated because we're saying the same thing. So AAAs can still be ADRCs, but there will be an administrative service organization that will be able to be an ADRC capital letter, if you will, that would have a responsibility for coordinating services and coordinating the providers or members of the Aging and Disability Resource Center. And we can come back to well, actually, I think I'll just go ahead and talk about it as long as we're going down that road. When you look at Iowa and how services are divided up, what they're looking at from the change is that long-term services and supports, things like community living, vocational services, residential services, those things would move to Aging and Disability Resource Centers. The resource center, even though it's called a center, the state is using the term similar to how they're using CCBHC, which is a certified community behavioral health clinic. Instead of designating a physical plant, they're designating a geographic area. So with the CCBHC, it's actually going to cover multiple counties, and Aging and Disability Resource Center will also cover multiple counties. That map and the map for Behavioral Health District will be the same. If you look at the draft map, there are 6 AAAs currently. They don't fit in that draft map. AAAs won't have to change their footprint, but they may be a member organization or an ADRC under multiple administrative service organizations because they're in multiple districts. Or they may apply to be the administrative service organization for that district. Under the behavioral health side, what the department is intending is that behavioral health would handle the brain health or mental health services and substance use services that are more short-term, looking at crisis services, recovery services, rehabilitation services. Those things are what they're looking at staying under the aging and behavioral health ASOs. Who can apply to be an ASO? A current region, MHDS region, can apply to be an administrative service organization. A current AAA can apply to be an administrative service organization. Nonprofit entities can apply. Governmental entities can apply. It's pretty broad on who actually can be the person who's applying. What the department has told us, and the CEOs have had opportunities, as have many other groups, what the department has told us is that their expectation is that there will be a collaborative approach in the development of the administrative service organization, and there will be a network approach, meaning that if May and I were in the same district, then they would expect to see some collaboration between the MHDS services, East Central region and Central Iowa Community Services. And they would also expect to see collaboration between the area agencies on aging, the provider networks, et cetera. And that does then bring up that we have to work together with our provider agencies. We have to work together with each other, and it does provide opportunity to ensure that you're not going to just have somebody come into an area and try to create some wonderful business for themselves, but have no relationship with the organizations, providers, and clients in the area. So I believe that is a good thing. One of the things that they are looking at with administrative service organization that has been something that I know that Jamie and I worked for a long time and were unsuccessful in trying to get changed is they did set a hard administrative cap. We tried to get them to let the department set an administrative cap. What they're doing is they're establishing an administrative service organization. First word is administrative, but they're capping that entity at 7% for administrative expense. They have not defined what goes into administration, but 7% if the entire function and purpose of your organization is administrative service organization, that could present a challenge when we look at it. Currently statewide, my understanding, and I don't have a count, but currently statewide there are hundreds, is what I've been told, hundreds of county employees that currently work for MHDS regions. A vast majority of those employees are in service coordination, care coordination, service management, different titles depending on where you are. But basically, they're the people who are the boots on the ground people that work day to day, face to face with an individual to try to help get them in services, coordinate services, help them achieve outcomes, and make sure that the individual has the ability to express what it is that they desire and have those needs met. At this point in time, there's a lot of question on will those functions be the same? Will those functions be done by the Administrative Service Organization for Behavioral Health or the Administrative Service Organization for Disability, Aging and Disability Services? And that will be something that will be finally identified when we see the actual scope of work that will be in those requests for proposals, which I should clarify. There will be 2 procurement processes, and Jamie did ask that we go over a timeline. And those 2 procurement processes, there will be one for ADRC and there will be one for behavioral health. And in each of those, there should be a scope of work identified that says that you will be doing these things and you will not be doing those things. What we have been told, and May can help me here if I'm missing something, but what we have been told is that there will still be a role for service coordination in the behavioral health, because there are services, especially when you look at crisis response, recovery, et cetera, and they have also thrown in justice, that those things seem to make more sense to fall in and stay with the behavioral health, which is where they are now. The long-term services and supports service coordination may go to aging and disability resources. That is kind of up in the air. But when you look at staffing, I know that in my region, I have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 service coordinators. We're a larger region, and there are a lot of questions from my folks on what happens, where do I go? And at this point in time, we're not sure. I do know that the department has talked about different ways of looking at how is service coordination provided. Is it a short-term, I connect you to somebody else, or is it a long-term and I continue to follow you? And that conversation is still there. Keep in mind that not only are we looking at this, we have a number of other initiatives that are going on in Iowa. I talked about the CCBHC initiative, and that initiative has a significant requirement for care coordination and crisis coordination that is coming into play at the same time as this. We also have integrated health home providers that provide care coordination for individuals on Medicaid. And we have our managed care organizations that provide case management that are looking at that as well. So that's kind of where the employees stuff falls in as far as service coordination. And Jamie had asked that we kind of talk about, I don't know that I really necessarily went into a lot of detail on what that service organization will do. And I think that's because we really haven't been given a lot of clear information on how that may be different from what we're currently doing. I do believe that the department is wanting something that is more cohesive and collaborative than what we have established right now. And I do believe that the department is going to come out with a lot more specific, this is what you will do and this is how you will do it, while giving some flexibility to local areas. There will be a state plan that says that you will have to do these things, and there will be district plans. And I would expect that those district plans will include a lot of, this is how we will do the things that we have been told that we have to do. I don't want to go on to the timeline until I'm going to switch it over to May and see if she has comments, and then we can talk about timelines, and we can show a picture of the draft map. I know that people are asking about that. But I will tell you, May said, do we want to have a copy of that map before we even started? And I did express a concern, because I think that if people look at the map, we'll go ahead and show the map. But if people look at the map and they think, well, this is the final map, I just please want to encourage you to consider it has not been determined to be the final map. But May, if you want to kind of talk, and then we'll talk about timelines.
I would just add some comments about core services, because that was something that came up a lot during legislative session. The concern that in the bill, and now which is law, that core services were not listed. Core functions are. Russell named some of them before. I think maybe forgot prevention and early intervention, crisis services, recovery support are the main core functions. And that's kind of the perspective that the Department of Health and Human Services is looking at this, is moving more towards what are the functions of the services that we want to support Iowans and their mental well-being, rather than just saying each behavioral health district, you have to have this, this X number of core services. I do believe in the state behavioral health plan and the procurement process with the RFP that will have a little bit more definition about what those services are, but also I think that we'll have a little bit of latitude to say, we believe this service meets this function, and they're really looking for what is prevention. So maybe we'll say, we're going to offer, as current MHDS regions consider proposing to be an ASO, we might say we're going to offer QPR training, assist training as prevention. So we'll have the opportunity to get a little bit more specific, and I think we'll have a little bit more direction as well, but we don't know those things quite yet. We do know that there will be outcomes that the administrative services organizations will be measured against. So if you think in terms of there's a function and then there's outcome, and then the opportunity for the ASOs to develop and to enhance the services in order to get to those outcomes. And timeline's a big one, so I'll let you go ahead with that, Russell.
Well, I got a couple of other things that I wanted to share, because this is something I shared with my board, and it's something that it's kind of a little hard to wrap your brain around. The legislation does not do away with regions. I know you probably heard the legislation does away with regions. The legislation does not do away with regions. The legislation does away with the requirement to have a region. The legislation allows an MHDS region to apply to be an ASO. So I know that that's a little subtlety there, but what the legislation does is it does away with the requirement for counties to form a 28E to create a region. It removes the funding that goes to a mental health and disability services region, but it doesn't preclude the counties that are currently in a mental health and disability services region. It doesn't say they cannot continue to be a region, apply for the administrative service organization and then use that money to continue to fund its staff and operations to fulfill the obligations of that contract. And I just wanted to be clear because it can be a little, what I've heard from a lot of people is the legislation eliminates regions. It really does not. It eliminates regions from the code, but mental health regions, I'm not an attorney. I'm sure there are attorneys on the call, but regions are 28E entities. It is not removing Iowa Code 28E. Counties can still come together and form a 28E and still be a region. And the reason I bring that up is because, again, those are the entities that are able to potentially apply to be one of the ASOs. Contracts leads me to another thing. One of the things that Jamie wanted to talk about was
Hey, Russell. We had a quick question. Could you go back on there in terms of it doesn't get rid of regions? Somebody wanted a follow-up question on that again. So please cover that again, please.
Cover it again. All right. I don't want to pick on an area, so I'm not going to pick on an area, but let's just say in Central Iowa Community Services, we're going to be in a district and there are 2 regions that are in that district. If the other region and Central Iowa Community Services both apply to be the administrative service organization and the other region is chosen, they're still going to operate under, or could continue to operate under, their current 28E. There are probably things that they'll need to change in their 28E. They could choose to be a 501c3. They could choose a lot of different organizational structures. But even in that case, Central Iowa Community Services may still exist. However, there's no funding that comes from the state to pay for the operations of CICS. CICS, however, might have a federal grant to do assisted outpatient treatment and might be able to use that grant money to pay staff to continue to carry out the functions of that grant. And I think that's important for people to think about, because if your mission and entity or your identity is wrapped up in the fact that you're a region, if you're not an administrative service organization, you probably go away. If your identity is that I am doing something to help individuals with brain health issues, with disabilities, et cetera, and there are other things within your scope that you have funding to do, you can still choose to do that. There may be regions out there that say, even though I'm not an ASO, I'm still going to do these things as long as it's not contrary to what state law allows those entities to do. Does that answer the question, Jamie?
I think so. We did have another quick follow-up question. Would the reason the counties would want to maintain, what would be the reason the counties would want to maintain a region with a 28E?
That's a good question. If you're an administrative service organization, it might be a little easier to answer. And at this point in time, I know that the CICS governing board is looking at their options. If they were an administrative service organization, what would that look like? Would they be a 28E? Would they want to look at a 501c3? What would the case be? I would suggest that there are a lot of counties that are part of 28Es right now that are not county government. It could be if you're part of a detention center, if you're part of an area agency on aging, if you're part of, there are a lot of things that counties are 28E members of, and this is still a service that's offered to the residents of the counties, so the county may choose to do that. Jamie, the interesting question is, if I'm in a region right now and I have 10 counties that are part of my 28E and they put me in a district where I have 20, then what happens? Do we add people? Do we change people? And that's a decision that the entities, I think, are going to have to make, the people who make those decisions. And I don't want to get fired here. So if anybody on my board's on here, don't fire me. I would point out that county supervisors are a minority of MHDS region board members at this point. And so I would encourage you to have conversations at your board meetings about how you want to move forward and what you might want to do and what that corporate structure would look like for you in the future, to make sure that if you're the entity applying, that you are the entity that's applying.
And then there was a follow-up question then in terms of the state is completely responsible for delivery of MHDS services. Doesn't the law prohibit counties from levying taxes for MHDS services? And so I don't think anything's changed from that.
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to address that, but
Okay.
but I might have read that legislation differently. What I'm saying is that the county wouldn't levy taxes to provide services. But I do know that CICS did apply for a federal grant. And if we do get the grant, it's $500,000 a year to do assisted outpatient treatment. And if we do get that grant, that would be money that CICS could use to pay to continue that program. We wouldn't use that money for other things because it would be earmarked from the grant for that particular product or that project. If CICS is not an ASO and we had that grant and the board decided they don't want to continue, then I think there would probably be closeout stipulations in that grant where we would say, as an entity, we no longer exist.
And then also kind of in concert with that, we had a question. Does this legislation eliminate a county's ability to fund substance use services, or can those services only be funded with state funds through ASOs or ADRCs?
Was that Lisa Heddens that asked that question?
You got it.
Lisa's on the board and she's asked that question. Lisa,
Yeah.
We have not gotten clarification from the state at all on that. I will tell you at this point, the legislation that was passed did not change. And that is a question, though, that is a valid question. And again, I'm not an attorney, but my understanding is the legislation that passed eliminated the code sections that dealt with counties and their involvement in MHDS. So I would encourage you to talk to your own county attorney on whether or not counties can levy and spend money on mental health, disabilities, brain health, intellectual, substance use, brain injuries, any of that stuff. I would encourage you to consider a conversation with your county attorney. It would surprise me if it was not, this is speculation I said I wasn't going to do, but it would surprise me if it is not the intent of the state that the things that the state is currently paying for, counties would not levy for in the future. To Lisa's question, there are things I know Story County is paying for that the state is not. And their question is, will they still have the capacity to do that? And if not, will the state come up with the money to offset the money that counties are currently putting in to cover that? So it's a very fair question. And unfortunately, we don't have any clarification on that. I do want to, however, that does transition into my next point, and that has to do with contracts, because this is really important thing for people to remember. The legislation does say that regions shall not enter into any contract that extends beyond June 30 of next year. And so I think that's important as people think about that if you're entering for your contracts for next fiscal year, you make sure that those contracts don't go beyond the fiscal year. So, all right, timeframes. The department has to submit a plan, which is a transition plan, by July of this year. And their intent is that they will have town hall meetings. We were told at a meeting yesterday, not by the department, by other people who had heard, which, by the way, I've heard a lot of things, but they heard that those town hall meetings could be starting as early as next week. Regardless, there are only 5 weeks between now and July 1. That transition plan will identify the things that the department has to do in order to move forward. July 1st, there will be at least one, but what we've heard is multiple draft maps that they will release, and then they will take feedback on those or that map. And by August 1st, they will have a final map that will identify the behavioral health districts. At that point, people will know my county is in this area, or it is in the same area or a different area. And it will also help MHDS regions to get a better understanding of what their geographic footprint may be, what their partners or collaboration folks might be as well. So that's something to consider. The department had different timelines for what they were looking at for the procurement process for ASOs, for ADRCs, than they did for behavioral health districts. Behavioral health districts have to be assigned no later than correct me, is it December 31st or January 1?
December 31st.
December 31st of this year. Depending on how much time they give themselves to review and decide, If they give themselves 30 days, that means that a proposal would have to be in December 1st. If they give the applicants 30 days to respond, that would mean that an RFP would come out November 1st. That's, again, timeframes that may or may not be there. The implementation then, full implementation of the ASO for behavioral health would be July 1 of 25. There would be some phase in between January 1 of 25 to July 1 of 25, where people would build up their programs and do the work necessary to actually come full on board on July 1. The department is intending a transition year. What we have been told is there's going to be a grace period. That's the term I'm using. That's not necessarily the term they've used. The intent is to ensure that people don't drop out of services. Try to keep the contracts alive if necessary to ensure that providers are getting paid. They want a no harm approach to this. So the following year to July of 26, the intent would be to try to do their best to make sure that things aren't hurt. Aging and Disability Resource Center, their intent was to have that potentially out in June, but they can't have it come out before the maps. And when the maps come out, I would not be surprised if the RFP for the ADRC stuff comes out more quickly, because a lot of the work that ADRC is going to be doing is already pretty well thought out and ironed out, but the behavioral health stuff has a little more development involved. So it could be a much sooner time frame that the request for proposals comes out with ADRCs. The intent is that, again, there would be a phase in for those ADRC items. And part of that probably is what scope of work or what entity does some of the work that MHDS regions currently do go under. Would I have specifically asked, somebody comes into a regional office, they need gap funding for a waiver service. There's a 5-year waiting list on waiver service. It's $400 and some dollars, $500 a day. The region approves the service. They have a care coordinator that works with the client. They fund the services up to $12,000 a month. Will it be the ADRC or the behavioral health district that handles that? And some preliminary conversations are that, well, LTSS stuff will go to ADRC, but we don't know for sure 100% where any of that is going. So timeframe then, that ADRC stuff would also come into play on July 1 of 25. The information that we have been given from the department is, for those of you that have been following, is that they are looking at a more holistic wellness approach. May had talked about just the whole system, and what the department wants is a whole being or well-being approach. And that's why if you look at the document that was released by the department in January of 23, when they looked at their reorganization, that included things like public health, community action, iSmiles. A lot of these local programs, what they're looking at doing is getting a system of care that looks at Russell, meets with Russell, gets to know Russell, identifies what Russell needs, coordinates Russell getting that, and not worry about, should this be May doing it or Russell doing it or Jamie doing it or somebody else doing it, but trying to get to a system of care where there is a wraparound approach to providing the supports that Russell needs. The department is very clear. This year they're targeting behavioral health because it's probably has the best infrastructure, but public health, I know county supervisors have had conversations with the department. Public health is one of the things that they're looking at. How does this fit into the bigger picture? Some people work with DCAT or community action agencies. Some of county supervisors are on different boards. Those things are going to be part of the conversations in the future as well. I don't know when, but they definitely will be part of that. Mayor, there are other things on the timeline. Otherwise, I'll share a copy of the map.
I think going back to the discussion about the regions and that they're not necessarily changing Iowa Code 2080, but the code section that does govern regions, which is Iowa Administrative Code Chapter 225C, will sunset on June 30th, 2025. And then a new administrative code, which will be 225A, will begin on 7/1 of 25. So the regions as we are will not have that revenue and not have the necessarily same authority that we have now as far as June 30th of next year, but then the ASOs then will pick up the very next day. I do want to talk about, just to make a mention to Russell, you've talked a little bit about contracting. And that's one of the things that I'm probably most concerned about, the timeline between December 31st of 24 and 7/1 of 25. To make sure that whoever the ASO is, that we get that contracting authority built up and approved so that we have that continuity of care and it becomes 7/1/25. People can still get services and providers can still get paid for providing those services. So I think that will really be a focus in the second half of this fiscal year, is making sure that that contract authority is in place.
And May, with that transition, you brought up, made me think of another thing, and that is staff. And I just pulled up the questions, and one person said, are the employees going to be state employees? And no, the employees would be the employees of the ASO. Or depending on how that ASO contracts. For instance, currently CICS contracts to Franklin County for all of our employees. Other regions, like in May's region, different counties have different employees that work for the ASO. The employees would be employees of whoever the ASO identifies, but they will not be state employees. The problem there is that my county would like to have me submit a budget to say what I'm going to spend, including my employee costs, and I may have no employee costs, the same employee costs, less employee costs, more employee costs, depending on whether or not I have a contract to be an ASO, and I will not necessarily know that before my county wants that information. So I would encourage the county supervisors and county auditors to be a little, I don't know, understanding if your community services staff aren't able to get you those numbers as quickly as you would like. The other option would be that, yes, we give you the budget with an understanding that it might just be a placeholder budget, so you can at least get it in. I would assume that counties would not want to budget for anything that there's not revenue coming in to cover. So that is there. I'm going to go ahead and I am going to share, just for conversation. This is the current draft map, and I'm going to try to make it a little bigger, maybe a little smaller than that. This map, as I have said before, this is the draft that the department had shared with the legislature when they were talking about the bill. And if I can just kind of give you an overview of current footprint, the area Northwest Iowa is actually 3 different regions comprise that area. North Central Iowa is primarily CICS, but it's half of Care Connections of North Iowa is also in that. And then some CSS counties and some Rolling Hills County. When you get in the center of the state, that happens. You get a lot of things together. The Northeast has 2 different regions in there. Eastern, which is the blue, is currently the Eastern region, which is the same. If you look at the bottom right, that is primarily Mahassey down there, but it also has some from other regions, including a couple of, a very large county from May's region. Central Iowa is a little different. Polk County has been able to be the Polk region since we started. They were the only county that was given the ability to be a single county region. But at this, with this map, they would pick up 3 of the CICS counties, 1 Cross County, and then 1 Heart of Iowa County. And then the remainder of the counties that are in Southwest would include the Southern Hills region, some of the Cross region, some of Heart of Iowa, and then the Southwest Iowa region. Again, this map is a draft map. The department had identified a couple of things. Number one, it gets away from some of the choppy things. If you look at our current map, there are some choppy things when you look at boundaries on maps. Number 2, the original maps were designed based on county relationships, which made a lot of sense because it was county funds. And we were the ones that were levying the dollars. We were the ones that were managing the dollars. And it made sense for county supervisors to be the ones that decided who their partners were. What the department is doing here is it is establishing the boundaries themselves. And again, draft map, but they are establishing the boundaries in areas based on what they have identified as Medicaid expenditures, traffic flows for services. For instance, if an individual lives in Warren County, do they really come to CICS for services, or do they go to Des Moines? And if they go to Des Moines, should we put them in the same district as Polk County? Those are some of the conversations that went into that map. I have heard from a lot of counties, not just my own, a lot of counties that don't know why they can't just stay with their current region. I will tell you that I've commiserated with many of my colleagues, because I also am losing counties, that, boy, wouldn't it be nice if our counties could stay with our region. I will tell you that I think that, again, something to understand is that this is not about counties. It is about a system of care that is funded by the state. And the question is, what is county involvement? County involvement, we didn't talk about that. I'm going to stop sharing. This draft map, I think, is on the HHS website. Jamie, do you have a copy you can send out? If not, so Jamie can make sure that it is sent out to people. But since I said that, May, what was I talking about before I said, Jamie, do you have a copy of the map?
Geez, you distracted me by thinking about the copy of the map too.
That's what I'm saying. Do you know what I was saying, Jamie? Yeah.
Don't
Nope.
remember.
All
I know
right.
that there was a question in the chat about, is the map based on population? And I think the map is based on a number of factors. One of them might be population. One of them also is sort of service utilization. And HHS has indicated to us that they've looked at, where do people go for services, and trying to create some of those traffic patterns, so to speak, according to where people already access services. So there were several factors that went into it, and I would say population was probably not the most important one.
Right. And if you look at the current map, the population ranges from 280,000 to 700 and some thousand, 710, 720,000. 750. So it isn't, it's also not just about county count, because as you can see, most of the regions have 17, 18, 19 counties in it, but the central and eastern have 6 and 5 respectively. So there were multiple factors that the state looked at on that. They are, however, like I said, we have been told multiple times, it's been brought up the MHDS Commission that they are willing to take input. And what we have been told is the month of July, they'll take formal input. And I think if people have comments on the map prior to that, then they can definitely provide that. I know what I was going to say. I was going to say that I've heard from a lot of people about concerns. And one of the things that we need to ensure is that if a county is going to a different region, then what services are available, and et cetera. And one of the questions here is, are all regions going to offer the same services? And that is the intent. The intent is that regardless of where you are in Iowa, that you would have the same services offered to you. Now, the reality of that is we do have some constraints in Iowa in different areas. If you don't have population, if you don't have workforce, et cetera, that definitely can create some constraints. And there were actually 2 different questions on opioid settlement dollars. Jamie, I don't have answers on those. We don't have just about where any of those opioid dollars fit in. Right now, they're county dollars. That's my understanding.
Yeah, there isn't anything in the legislation that would preclude the counties from going ahead and doing what they're already planning to do for opioid settlement funding and so forth. I did raise this issue with the director when the legislation was moving through, and how that would work with substance use and so forth. And I didn't really get a firm answer. So I think just proceed and moving forward for the counties on what you're planning to do for the services because of the opioid settlement funds.
And a lot of people, I think, have good plans on there. I do know that some of our colleagues have shared with us what they're involved in. Of course, those distributions were made based on population, and some larger counties have very involved plans, and some counties that are smaller are using their dollars to try to build up some outreach or response services. And that's, I think many counties, if not all of them, and I don't know if it was a requirement, have developed committees that have looked at the best ways to invest those dollars. So,
Russell, can I make a comment? The opioid settlement fund questions reminded me that we have not talked about that the bill creates that the administrative services organizations will become instrumentalities of the state. And that is important because when the ASOs are instrumentalities of the state, then that gives us the ASOs authority to pass through and to use, to utilize, and to administer the federal block grant dollars that the state gets. So that would be the federal mental health block grant as well as the substance use block grant. So if you're thinking about like what is going to fund this system, there's the current MHDS allocation. There is the money that right now is sitting in the incentive fund. There is the federal substance use and mental health block grants. And then there's a little bit of funding that comes into for the tobacco prevention and gambling prevention. So we haven't seen final numbers. We have not seen a formula for how those melded pot will be dispersed. Currently, MHDS regions receive their funding based on a per capita. We don't know if it's going to be per capita. We don't know if it's going to be based on the number of providers, the number of people who use services. We just don't know that yet.
and we do know that some money they will keep and spend themselves on statewide programs like 988 or Your Life Iowa. Those dollars will be taken straight off the top. Jamie, did you have other questions here that we haven't?
Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered them, or we should be up to date.
I want to talk just a little bit about staff. And I know that there were some questions about, are they going to continue to be considered county or state employees? And I think it's really important for people to understand that all of this stuff in the scope of work is still up in the air. And I know that I do continue to try to keep my staff aware of what's going on. And I had mentioned earlier that some of them had asked if they could zoom in and listen to the presentation here. It's important for people to understand that the work that we do is important. The work that our staff members do is important, and that work isn't going away. It may be that the people have a different approach to the work they do. It may be that their job duties are different. It may be that they work for somebody else. But I would encourage people that we're continuing to move forward, and we are not going to not do what we're doing. I also know that there are people who have asked at meetings that I've been to, well, why are we going to do this? Why don't we just do nothing until we know exactly what we're supposed to do? And I would encourage people to consider the fact that because we're in human services, we're dealing with human beings. And even if we are changing what we're doing between now and when everything gets settled, if we know that doing something differently is better, we should change the way we do things. And I bring this up because I know that we have some internal things we're looking at doing here, that if we do something that's an evidence-based approach, it's different than what we're doing, but the state might come in and tell us to do something different a year from now. So should we change? And my response is, if it was your child or your parent or your spouse, would you want the region to just do nothing better between now and July 1 of 25? Or would you want them to continue to do the best that they can to try to make sure that people get their services taken care of? And that's what I would encourage you to consider. There are, one last thing, there are established advisory committees there's an advisory committee in the legislation. There are 10 members in the advisory committee, and I believe that 3 members, Jamie, the actual language might have been changed to say county supervisors. At one point it was local elected officials, but I think it says county supervisors now. Is that correct?
I don't believe it does specifically call for supervisors, but locally elected officials. So yeah. And then it did add a sheriff to that, or local law enforcement.
Yep. So when you look at it from that perspective, I know that there are currently in legislation, there are 2 advisory committees. This actually goes to 1 advisory committee and looks at there's specific tenet in there for children's representative as well, to make sure that we're hitting the whole gamut of all of the services.
The thing that did specifically have there in regard to county supervisors was in development of the plan. So as they put the plan together and they start going around and so forth, county supervisors were specifically named to be consulted in the development of that plan.
So I want to just give my positive viewpoint on this, and not everything that's going to come out of this is necessarily going to be positive, but I want to give my positive viewpoint on this, and that is that historically what we've done is we've treated a person's substance use issue, or we've treated a person's disability, or we've treated a person's brain health issue. But what the state is aiming for, whether we get there or not, what they're aiming for is working with the person, not the person's illness, not the person's problems, but working with the person. When you look at the approach, the Thrive Iowa stuff that the governor talked about in her condition of the state in earlier this year, the approach is that they want to look at Russell as a human being and see what does Russell need to thrive, and with the intent that it should be government's role to be there, help Russell go, and then walk away. It should not be government's role to build dependence upon itself or to create a system that is cumbersome and difficult for someone to navigate. And that is, I'm sure if any of you have been watching the legislation go through and hearing the conversation from the department, that is something they have identified, that people don't know who to go to. It's complicated. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it consistent across the entire state, and people will be able to go where they need to go. They want co-location, they want collaboration, they want systems of care. And so I think it's an admirable goal, and hopefully we'll actually get there. There's a question that somebody wants to know what happens to the properties owned by the regions. We have asked that question, and I know that I believe Rolling Hills actually owns a building, and they haven't decided for sure what actually happens. Every region, even if it's just computers, everybody owns something, and we haven't heard for sure what is going to be there. So I'm looking to see if it's, there was a question about CSN and whether CSN will still continue to be utilized. Again, I know that in conversations, I'm actually on the ISAC board, and in the conversations we've had, I think that they are trying to position themselves to be an asset to the department. Currently, the regions are paying for CSN. I'm just rounding around $1 million a year that comes. And so the CSN needs to prove and show its value. I think that we all feel it has value. And as long as we can continue to show value, then I'm hoping it will still be used, but we don't know for sure. And they, of course, will definitely get to decide that.
We had one question here, Russell, at the end. How will this affect prevention services that are currently in place, like IPM prevention, tobacco, SOR, et cetera?
My understanding, May, is that the ASO will be responsible for ensuring that it happens, but I don't know that there's a requirement that it's happening with different providers. But I think that the ASO has to ensure this stuff happens. And there, May mentioned earlier, there will be deliverables and outcomes. And that will be one of the things is making sure. I don't know who anonymous attendee keeps saying, well, any county funds help, but I'm not sure what the question means. I've seen it pop up. Do they mean if the county gives money, will that be helpful? Or is the question, will the county have to give money? I don't know if they want to clarify their question.
Gotcha.
I'd like to say just 1 second more about the prevention and the substance use services, as well as what Russell, you talked about earlier in the hour about the aging and disability services. I think there has been a perception out there that the ASOs are just taking over everything. And what you just said was the ASOs have to make sure that these services are available. So that might mean the same contracts that are in place, but now the ASOs are putting those contracts out rather than the Department of Health and Human Services. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the ASOs are consuming all of the provider, the Iowa Provider Network or anything like that, where the ASOs will just be assuring that those services are still available.
And I think that's a good point, May. Thank you, because I know the county supervisors, again, have had those conversations about public health, and there have been some concerns about what does that mean for public health. I don't believe that I've heard any conversations that the ASOs will take over public health. I do believe there have been conversations about outcomes, deliverables, and I do believe, as recently as March, when Director Garcia talked to the group, that there is a plan, at least, for some potential consolidation of public health agencies, like what happened to county mental health agencies when we became regions. I don't know where that's at. I don't know when that might be. I would just encourage people to be aware of it. I also would say that I think there are some things that we're doing now that I felt like Franklin County was doing a great job. I felt like we were doing everything we needed to do. I do feel like there are things we're able to do now that we were not able to do before we were a region. And I just would throw that out. Doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong now. I'm just thinking there are potentially some things we can do better. I did see somebody here saying that they were from a rural area and they're looking forward to having some of the services brought out to those areas as well. And I think that's one of the things the department is looking at. May have mentioned the funding may not come out on a per capita basis. It may come out on a project basis, that this needs to be developed here. So we're going to put some money over here to develop that. I don't know what their thought process is, but that hopefully is something that they can do.
So I just wanted to just make a few comments on behalf of ISAC. It was really important for us to have this webinar right away since the governor has signed the legislation. As Russell prefaced at the very beginning, there are a lot of these things we don't know yet. That is why it was very important that we did have this webinar to get those questions from you so that we can follow up with all of you as additional questions pop up and so forth. I have a laundry list here based on the questions that we've seen in the chat and so forth in regard to the county's ability to fund substance use and mental health services and so forth, and getting more of a solid legal opinion on that. We will, again, this will be, this is recorded, we'll get it posted, and we'll also provide a listed timeline. I think, Russell, people wanted some slides and so forth, so we can come up with that timeline and provide that for everyone to have. In regard to opioid settlement and how that would work in relation to it. So that's something that we'll certainly follow up on as well. And then certainly property owned by the regions. I know also too, Russell, you went into detail about, the relationship of county employees and so forth. And I'm sure there'll be some employment questions. So I would just say, again, this is certainly a work in progress. We wanted to have this webinar right away. And again, in the meantime, if you have questions, don't hesitate, as you all are not very shy at all, to Jay Cashman at iowacounties.org, and we'll address them as they pop up. And with that, I'll turn it over to Russell and May for any final comments.
A couple of final comments. Number one, the counties will have to close out their financial books at the end of regions, I should say, at the end of next fiscal year. And there have been a lot of concerns about how do I send this money back or whatever, and it's unobligated, unencumbered funds that will have to be spent back. So you may have some contracts or some claims or some staff costs, et cetera, that you'll be able to keep some money. On a general basis, and I know May also had something she wanted to say, but on a general basis, I just want to be clear that I'm not an attorney, that what I'm giving here is just an overview of my understanding. And if you have questions on a legal issue, you definitely should talk to your attorney. Secondly, I'm giving you my understanding on how I see this. You all have CEOs that cover your counties. If your CEO tells you that I'm wrong about something, well, they're probably wrong. But if your CEO has a different viewpoint than I do, please reach out to them and talk to them about their perception. We as CEOs have talked about this a lot, and I think it's important for you to hear from your CEO what their perspective is and how they see you moving forward and things that you need to think about. Thank you for actually taking the time to listen. I know that this is an important thing in Iowa, and it will continue to be an important thing regardless of who does the work. May.
Two things for me. For the folks who are looking for slides, we chose not to do slides today because the Department of Health and Human Services has slides out there about how we got there. So if you're really looking for some of that detail, please look at their website. And if you go to the Iowa HHS website and just search realignment, you'll find it. So we didn't want to trump what HHS has put out already for the slides and the information about how we got here. And then I'll just close by saying we can look at this as an opportunity. I think there's been a lot of great work in the MHDS regions in the last 10 years. I've been around long enough that I remember Senate File 69 25 years ago, and there's been a lot of great work since then. But this is just the next step, right? And this is the next step in our evolution. And we really need to look at it as an opportunity for us just to do better, to be better, to have better collaborations, and to make sure all Iowans are well.
I do have the link. I don't know if I put it in the chat, it doesn't necessarily go anywhere, so I don't know. Yeah, I'll just email it to Jamie and then he can share out the link to what May was just referring to, and feel free to go there and check it out. So unless there are other questions, Jamie, I think we're done.
That's it.
And Jamie, this is recorded and available online.
You got it. Yep. We will be posting it.
All right. Thank you, folks. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.